The silver case. JFK International Airport buzzed with activity on that crisp winter afternoon. It was the kind of chaotic scene where every traveler, from the hurried businessman to the stressed family of four, seemed to be rushing toward something important. In the midst of this flurry of movement, Olivia Harris moved with calm precision, as if unaffected by the rush. She carried herself with a dignity born of years of discipline, her movements deliberate and poised. Olivia wasn't just any passenger. She had just received one of the nation's highest honors, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, for her tireless work in the field of national security. Her past as an intelligence officer was marked by quiet victories and the kind of secretive triumphs that kept the nation safer. A woman of many accolades, her name wasn't widely recognized by the general public, but those who mattered knew her well. Today, however, as she moved through the airport, she was just another passenger, one who happened to carry a glistening silver suitcase. The suitcase, sleek and compact, was not merely a piece of luggage. To those who knew her past, it represented the weight of her accomplishments, the sacrifices of her career, and the recognition she had finally received. However, to those who didn't know her, it was just another shiny, metal bag that caught the eye. And one woman, in particular, seemed to find it more than a mere bag. As Olivia walked through the terminal, she noticed a few curious glances. People were watching her more closely than usual, but she attributed this to the fact that she was dressed impeccably in a black suit with a crisp white shirt. Her neatly styled hair and composed appearance made it impossible for anyone to overlook her, but what she didn't realize was that her calmness would soon become the very thing that drew suspicion. Among the crowd, Alice Carter, a flight attendant stationed at the gate, couldn't take her eyes off Olivia's silver suitcase. There was something about the way Olivia handled it, the way she didn't let anyone assist her, the way she locked it with a deliberate and precise motion. Alice had seen many passengers over the years, but something about this woman, and particularly the suitcase, set her on edge. Alice's gaze followed Olivia as she approached the check-in counter. The gate agent greeted Olivia with a warm smile, unaware of the scrutiny she was under. "Good afternoon, Miss Harris," the agent said, verifying her ticket. "Welcome aboard. Have a pleasant flight." Olivia nodded with a polite smile and stepped forward, her gaze now scanning the boarding area as she moved toward the first-class cabin. The calm, reassuring atmosphere of the cabin stood in stark contrast to the hustle of the airport terminal. As she stepped into the plush first-class section, she immediately felt a sense of relief. Here, in the luxury of soft leather seats and warm lighting, she could relax. She took her seat in the front row and carefully placed her silver suitcase into the overhead compartment. With the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, Olivia locked it securely. But as she settled into her seat, her sharp instincts, the same ones honed over years of covert work, told her something was off. The brief glance exchanged between Alice and another flight attendant, Mark Simmons, didn't escape her notice. She wasn't paranoid, but she knew when people were watching her. And right now, it was clear that Alice Carter was watching her, or more specifically, her silver case. Olivia chose not to react. She was used to being observed, even under suspicious circumstances. Throughout her life, she had learned to handle this kind of attention. She sat back in her seat, her phone in hand, reading through the congratulatory messages that had flooded in after her Medal of Freedom ceremony. The messages were heartwarming, but Olivia found it difficult to fully relax as the feeling of being scrutinized hung heavily in the air. Meanwhile, Alice and Mark exchanged a few words in the cabin before Mark moved toward Olivia. His eyes widened in recognition when he saw her. "Olivia Harris. Wow, I can't believe I'm meeting you here," Mark said, his voice filled with excitement. Olivia looked up from her phone, a faint, polite smile forming on her lips. "Yes, that's me," she replied calmly. "It's nice to meet you." She offered her hand, but before Mark could shake it, Alice stepped forward, her tone firm but controlled. "Sir, please return to your seat," Alice said, her eyes unwavering as she focused on Olivia's suitcase in the overhead compartment. Mark, confused but willing to comply, glanced between Alice and Olivia. "I was just saying hello. It's nothing serious." But Alice's eyes remained fixed on the suitcase. "We need to ensure the safety of all passengers on board," she insisted. "Please return to your seat." Mark, still unsure of what was going on, hesitated for a moment before walking back to his seat. He stole another glance at Olivia as he sat down, but Olivia didn't react. She could sense that something was amiss, but she chose to remain composed. Alice, meanwhile, lingered by the overhead compartment for a few moments longer. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way Olivia had handled her suitcase, the way she had locked it with such precision. It all felt deliberate, but what could it mean? After a moment, Alice reluctantly walked away, but the sense of unease in her gut only intensified. She knew she couldn't ignore it, but she also didn't want to make a scene. The woman in seat 1A wasn't like the usual first-class passengers she had encountered. The suitcase, there was something about it that didn't sit right with her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Returning to the cockpit, Alice found her longtime colleague, Mike Thompson, running through the pre-flight checklist. She approached him with a tense expression, her worry evident in her body language. "Mike, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low. Mike, who had been focused on his checklist, looked up at her. "What's wrong, Alice? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's the woman in seat 1A," Alice said quietly, her voice filled with unease. "The one with the silver suitcase." Mike frowned. "The silver suitcase? Alice, come on. What's the big deal? It's just a bag." Alice shook her head, her arms crossed tightly. "No, Mike. It's the way she's acting. The way she won't let anyone touch it. The way she locked it. It's not normal." Mike raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Alice, she's probably just some business executive or a politician. They all act like that. It's not unusual." But Alice didn't share his reassurance. "I don't know, Mike. Something feels wrong. I think we need to take a closer look." Mike sighed, clearly frustrated. "Look, Alice, I'm not saying you're wrong, but we can't go around accusing passengers without concrete evidence. If you're really that concerned, you can report it to the captain, but don't escalate this without a good reason." Alice nodded reluctantly, though her thoughts were far from settled. She glanced back toward the cabin, her mind still racing. The sense of unease gnawed at her, growing stronger by the minute. In the passenger cabin, Olivia remained completely unaware of the brewing storm. She glanced out of the window as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. The chatter of the passengers around her seemed distant, and she could finally allow herself a moment of peace, but she knew it wouldn't last. Whatever was happening, she could feel it in the air. The silver suitcase she carried, which had once symbolized years of dedicated service to her country, was now the catalyst for a growing tension she couldn't yet comprehend. The unseen tension. As the plane ascended into the sky, the muffled roar of the engines filled the cabin, a constant hum that should have been a source of comfort to Olivia. Yet the tension in the air felt palpable, a presence that clung to the space around her, suffocating in its quiet persistence. From the moment the plane had taken off, Olivia's senses remained alert, her intuition honed through years of navigating high-stakes situations. Something was wrong. She could feel it. It wasn't the usual discomfort of cramped seats or the subtle chaos that comes with air travel. No, this was different. The subtle glances from the flight attendants, the stiff postures of the other passengers, everything seemed to signal a growing unease, and it all seemed to be centered around her. Olivia was no stranger to suspicion. As an intelligence officer, she had encountered far worse: scrutiny from fellow operatives, heightened security protocols in hostile environments, and moments where every move felt like it was under the microscope. But there was something unique about this situation, a more insidious undercurrent that she couldn't ignore. It was the feeling of being watched not because of her actions, but because of what she represented. The silver suitcase, so innocuous to her, had become the focus of someone else's doubts. She adjusted in her seat, her fingers lightly gripping the armrests. Her mind wandered back to the moments before she boarded the plane. The quick but sharp look from Alice Carter, the flight attendant who had eyed her with an unsettling intensity. Olivia had brushed it off at the time, but now, as the plane leveled off, the unease began to grow into something more tangible. Why had Alice been so focused on the silver case? Why had she acted so guarded? It was as if the suitcase itself had become an accusation, one that Olivia could neither deny nor address. The memory of her training resurfaced, the need to remain composed, to let nothing on the outside betray the thoughts running through her mind. She had learned long ago that in moments like this, silence was often the most powerful weapon. But the weight of suspicion was a heavy burden, and today it was threatening to break her calm resolve. In the cockpit, Mike Thompson reviewed his pre-flight checklist, his mind partly on the procedures and partly on his colleague Alice. He could feel her unease from the moment she entered the cockpit, her eyes shadowed with doubt. As a seasoned flight attendant, Alice had seen her fair share of odd behaviors, but this one felt different. Something about the woman in seat 1A, her sleek suit, and most notably, her silver suitcase, made Alice feel as though something was being concealed. There was no logical reason for her suspicion, but that gut feeling, a flight attendant's sixth sense, was impossible to ignore. But Mike was skeptical. "Alice, you've worked hundreds of flights. You can't let a hunch make you jump to conclusions," he had told her earlier. Yet, as he continued to mull over Alice's words, a thought nagged at him. What if she was right? What if there was something more to this? His job was to keep passengers safe, not to dismiss his colleagues' instincts. But Alice's persistence in her suspicion of the suitcase gnawed at him. Back in the cabin, Olivia sat quietly, her eyes scanning her phone as she responded to messages from colleagues, friends, and dignitaries who had congratulated her on receiving the Medal of Freedom. The recognition had been years in the making, a reflection of her dedication and countless sacrifices. Yet the praise was a mere backdrop to the reality of her life, one constantly under the microscope, where anonymity was a luxury she rarely had. Today, the weight of that truth felt heavier than usual. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle tap on her shoulder. Olivia looked up, startled, to see Alice standing there, a polite smile on her face, but her eyes narrowed with something more. "Excuse me, Miss Harris," Alice said, her voice smooth but betraying a hint of tension. "I'm afraid I need to check your ticket again. It's just a routine procedure." Olivia, accustomed to the unexpected, didn't flinch. Her gaze remained calm as she responded, "I've already presented my ticket and ID. Is there an issue?" Alice's eyes flickered briefly to the overhead compartment, where the silver suitcase lay hidden behind the closed compartment door. It was as though the bag itself was calling for attention, urging Alice to confirm the suspicion that had been growing in her chest. She struggled to maintain her composure, her lips forming a tight smile. "No issue at all, Miss Harris," Alice replied, though the edge in her voice was undeniable. "It's just a routine check." Olivia nodded, her voice measured as she pulled the ticket from her bag and handed it to Alice. The interaction, seemingly polite and harmless, set off a chain of reactions that neither woman could have anticipated. As Alice walked away, her mind churned with questions. What exactly was Olivia hiding? Why had she been so protective of the silver suitcase? It wasn't just the way she had locked it. There was something in her posture, her body language, that suggested a level of wariness that Alice found unusual. Most passengers in first class were affluent and self-assured, not on edge or overly guarded. Alice could feel the weight of her suspicions growing, pressing against her chest like a stone. She returned to the galley, where Mike was preparing for the in-flight service. Her steps were purposeful, but there was a visible tension in her movements. She had to talk to him again. "Mike," Alice said quietly, lowering her voice, "I'm telling you, there's something wrong with the woman in seat 1A. I can feel it. The suitcase, She's hiding something. I'm sure of it. Mike stopped what he was doing, his expression hardening as he turned to face her. Alice, this is getting out of hand. You're making assumptions without any evidence. You don't have anything concrete. It's just a suitcase. People travel with all sorts of things. But Alice wasn't so easily dissuaded. It's not just the suitcase. It's how she behaves. She's too careful, too deliberate. No one acts like that unless they're trying to hide something. Mike sighed, rubbing his temples. You need to calm down. If you really think there's an issue, go ahead and report it to the captain. But don't make this a bigger deal than it is. Alice hesitated. She didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but her gut told her she couldn't let it go. The thought of being the one to ignore something that could endanger everyone, gnawed at her. She turned away from Mike, heading back toward the cabin. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was aboard this flight, hidden inside that silver suitcase. In the meantime, Olivia, unaware of Alice's growing fixation, continued to monitor her surroundings. Her eyes flickered toward the other passengers as they settled into their seats, preparing for the duration of the flight. She could sense the building undercurrent of tension. Whispers from passengers, quiet glances exchanged across the aisle. It was a subtle thing, but she could feel the shift. She had been in situations before where the air seemed to thicken with suspicion. This wasn't her first time being on edge. Her instincts, sharpened over years of high-stakes situations, told her that something was coming, something she couldn't control. And the silver suitcase that she had brought as a mere symbol of achievement had become the source of that tension. The object that had once held only personal significance, the culmination of years of service, was now a potential threat in the eyes of others. The faint buzz of the cabin's lighting, the murmur of passengers, and the hum of the plane as it cruised smoothly above the clouds couldn't drown out the rising tide of unease. Olivia, a woman who had spent years diffusing high-risk situations, felt the tightening knot in her stomach. She knew that this flight would not be like any other. Whatever lay ahead would be beyond her control, and the silver suitcase would play a central role in it. Somehow, she knew that the world was about to see a very different side of her, one that could no longer be hidden behind a polite smile and a carefully maintained composure. She was about to confront the latent biases that had remained beneath the surface, unseen and unspoken until now. And in the process, the truth would be revealed, a truth that would change everything. The tipping point. The atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Olivia, it was as glaring as a flashing light. The soft hum of the engines, the occasional clink of a drink cart, the rustle of newspaper pages turning. These sounds were drowned out by the uneasy silence that now seemed to hang in the air. People weren't speaking to each other as much, their conversations muffled and distracted. The kind of buzz that usually filled the first-class section had all but disappeared, replaced by quiet exchanges of glances. Olivia had been traveling for years, across borders, through airports, aboard planes, and she had learned to read the signs. She knew when she was being scrutinized, and right now, that was all she could feel. Her every movement seemed amplified, her every gesture observed. It wasn't that she was paranoid, but something was definitely off. Her instincts, finely tuned through years of covert operations and dangerous assignments, screamed that something was amiss. She could feel eyes on her, and she could sense the shift in the dynamic of the flight. She glanced over at the flight attendants, Alice in particular, who had yet to remove her gaze from Olivia's seat, though her attention had shifted briefly to the aisle and back. There was a rigidity to Alice's posture, a tightness in her movements that Olivia recognized all too well. It was the posture of someone on edge, of someone who was preparing for an eventual confrontation. Though she hadn't fully realized it yet, Alice was building up to something. The silver case. It had been a symbol of pride for Olivia, a representation of her years of tireless work in national security, a testament to the sacrifices she'd made for her country. But now it was something else. Now It was the focal point of suspicion. She couldn't understand why a mere piece of luggage had become a source of such palpable unease. But as she looked around the cabin, she saw that it wasn't just Alice's behavior that had changed. Other passengers, too, were stealing glances, eyes flickering toward the overhead compartment, then quickly darting away as if ashamed of their curiosity. It was clear that the silver case, though innocuous to her, had become an unspoken question on the lips of every passenger. Olivia's thoughts swirled as she adjusted her seatbelt and settled further into her chair, her posture deliberately calm, her breathing steady. She could not let the tension affect her. Not now. Not when she had worked so hard to achieve everything she had, including this medal of freedom. To be reduced to suspicion because of a suitcase she had carried countless times before, was almost surreal. And yet, here she was, the center of an unspoken drama that was escalating by the minute. As the flight progressed, Olivia tried to lose herself in the details of the flight, listening to the captain's announcements, observing the calm skies through the window, trying to calm the stirring discomfort in her chest. But the unease only grew. Then, the real turning point came, and Olivia knew that whatever had been simmering beneath the surface had finally reached its boiling point. It happened when another passenger, a man seated several rows behind Olivia, stood up to stretch his legs. His movement, clumsy and abrupt, startled a woman seated near him. She had been nodding off, but the sudden motion made her spill their drink, a glass of wine that tipped and splashed across the aisle. The woman jumped up in shock, her voice raised in alarm. A flight attendant, a young man, quickly came to her aid, helping her clean up the spill. Olivia remained still, watching the scene unfold, when she felt a sharp gaze upon her once again. It was Alice. She was standing near the galley, her eyes fixed on Olivia's seat as though waiting for something to happen. Olivia was no fool. She knew Alice was waiting for an excuse to confront her, an excuse to make this whole situation explode. And explode it did. Without warning, Alice marched down the aisle, her steps purposeful and heavy. Olivia's mind raced, but she kept her expression neutral. She didn't want to show any sign of being rattled, though inside, a storm was brewing. Alice stopped in front of her seat, her back straight and her shoulders tense, as if preparing for a battle. "Miss Harris," Alice began, her voice louder than necessary, "I'm afraid I need to ask you to step into the galley for a moment. We need to address an issue with your luggage." The words hit Olivia like a shockwave. She had expected something, but not this. This was the moment where everything would change. This was the moment where suspicion would solidify into action. Olivia's sharp eyes met Alice's, the weight of their stare locked for a moment longer than was necessary. She could feel the ripple of tension spread through the cabin, the sharp breaths of passengers who were witnessing this interaction, wondering what would happen next. Olivia rose from her seat, her movements measured, her face carefully composed. She didn't want to give Alice, or anyone else on the plane, the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The flight attendants exchanged glances as she made her way down the aisle, and for a moment, Olivia could swear that some of the passengers were whispering behind her back. There was an undertone of fear, of suspicion, of judgment. When Olivia stepped into the galley, Alice immediately shut the curtain behind them, enclosing them in a small, confined space. The quiet buzz of the plane's engines faded into a tense silence that seemed to pulse with the unspoken words between them. "Miss Harris," Alice began again, her voice strained, "I need to ask you about the silver case in your overhead compartment. We've received some concerns about its contents." Olivia blinked, momentarily taken aback by the bluntness of the question. She hadn't expected this confrontation, but she had also learned to keep her composure in the face of impossible situations. She took a breath before responding, her voice calm but firm. "There is nothing wrong with my luggage, Alice. That case contains nothing more than personal belongings." Alice's eyes flickered with disbelief. "I'm sorry, Miss Harris, but we're not taking any chances. We've had reports of suspicious items on flights recently, and I'm afraid I can't allow your luggage to go unchecked. I'm going to need to verify what's inside." Olivia's heartbeat quickened, but she didn't show it. She had faced interrogations, high-level operations, and threats that tested every ounce of her courage. But this was different. There was something so personal about the suspicion Alice was levying on her. It wasn't just a matter of protocol. It felt like an attack on everything Olivia had worked for. "Do you realize what you're implying, Alice?" Olivia's voice was low but sharp. "You're suggesting that a Medal of Freedom recipient, someone who has dedicated her life to national security, is a threat simply because of the suitcase she's carrying. Are you really prepared to go this far based on your personal suspicion?" Alice faltered for a moment. She hadn't expected the confrontation to go this way. Her own anxiety was palpable. She was in over her head, and the pressure to justify her actions weighed heavily on her. But her mind was made up. She couldn't back down now. "I'm sorry, Miss Harris, but I'm following protocol. It's not personal. We just can't afford to ignore any possible threat." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the galley was thick, suffocating. Olivia could see that Alice was convinced, or at least unwilling to entertain the possibility that she was wrong. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "If you must check the case, then do it. But know this. I've had enough of being judged for what I carry with me. I have spent my life working to keep this country safe, and for you to stand here and accuse me of being a threat based on my race, my achievements, or the appearance of my luggage, that is something I cannot tolerate." Alice stood there, speechless for a moment, the weight of Olivia's words sinking in. She had crossed a line, and she was beginning to realize just how far she had gone. But it was too late to turn back now. The stage was set, and the confrontation would unfold in ways neither woman could have predicted. And what started as a simple flight would soon become the catalyst for a much larger and more profound reckoning, one that would force everyone to confront the deep-seated biases that had shaped their perceptions and their actions. The silent storm. As the door to the galley shut behind Olivia and Alice, the plane's hum seemed to fade into a muffled stillness, thick with anticipation. The crew members outside remained unaware of the growing tension unfolding just a few feet away. Olivia could sense the weight of the moment, her every thought sharpened, every muscle poised. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a covered operation or a high-stakes negotiation. It was an ordinary flight, turned extraordinary by the invisible yet undeniable forces of bias, fear, and misunderstanding. Olivia's eyes met Alice's, but this time there was no warmth or pretense of politeness in the younger woman's expression. Alice's jaw was clenched, her gaze fixed with uncomfortable determination. She wasn't going to back down, not after everything she'd already done. The suspicion was no longer a whisper in her mind. It had grown into a loud, unshakable belief, and now it was too late to turn back. "What are you hoping to find, Alice?" Olivia's voice cut through the tension, sharp but calm, with a steady undercurrent of challenge. "Do you think that a silver case, or my mere presence, is enough to suggest that I'm somehow dangerous? Is this what you've been trained to do? To judge people on what they look like, or what they carry, rather than who they are?" Alice swallowed, momentarily unsure of how to respond. Her hand hovered at her side, as though she was still unsure whether to call for additional help, to escalate this situation into something more. She had already crossed a line by stopping Olivia in the first place, and now, standing in the galley with the weight of the decision looming over her, she realized that the situation was beyond her control. Her initial anxiety over the silver case had transformed into something more, a deep, unsettling sense of dread. "I'm just following procedures," Alice finally murmured, her voice thinner than before, betraying a hint of uncertainty. "There are regulations, Miss Harris. We can't take risks, not anymore." Olivia studied Alice, her mind racing. She could see the young flight attendant's discomfort, the way her fingers twitched by her side, as if she was struggling to maintain the illusion of control. Alice wasn't bad. She wasn't inherently malicious. But in this moment, Olivia realized that Alice was trapped by something much larger than both of them. She was trapped by the invisible boundaries of suspicion, by an ingrained system that taught her to fear what she didn't understand. "What regulations, Alice?" Olivia said, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Are you telling me that my presence here, as a Medal of Freedom recipient, someone who has been vetted by every possible agency, still isn't enough to prove that I am who I say I am? That you would question me solely because of a silver suitcase?" Alice didn't answer at first. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to argue back, to hold her ground. But another part of her, the one that had been taught to be deferential, to follow orders, was struggling to find the right words. She was caught in the middle of a moral conflict she hadn't prepared for. And the longer she stood there, the more she realized that the fear she had felt earlier, the fear that had prompted her to call attention to Olivia's case, was born not from logic, but from something far more primal: prejudice. "Listen," Alice said, her voice tinged with frustration now. "I don't know what's in that case, and that's the problem. You're making this harder by being so defensive. If you just cooperate, this will be over. I'm only trying to keep everyone on this plane safe. Isn't that what you want too?" Olivia looked at Alice for a long moment, a complex array of emotions running through her. On one hand, she felt the deep, simmering anger of someone who had been wrongly accused for the umpteenth time simply because of her race. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel a sliver of sympathy for Alice. She was just doing her job, after all. But in that moment, Olivia knew that something had to change. She couldn't let this injustice stand unchallenged, not just for her own sake, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged or marginalized because of their appearance. "What do you think you're going to find, Alice?" Olivia repeated, her voice now steady and deliberate. "You're looking at me, judging me by the way I carry myself, by what's in my bag, not by who I am or what I've done. I've dedicated my life to serving this country, to protecting the people who would never even understand what that means. Do you really believe that all of that means nothing? That I'm somehow a threat simply because of the color of my skin or the way I hold my case?" For a moment, the words hung in the air, and the silence between them seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The hum of the plane faded, as if even the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Alice shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the floor, and for the first time since their conversation began, Olivia saw something in her eyes, a flicker of realization. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to change the course of what had already begun. "I don't think you're a threat," Alice whispered, barely audible. "But the rules, they don't let me think for myself. I'm just following orders, Olivia. I don't want to make this worse." "You've already made it worse," Olivia replied, her voice calm but firm. "You've already decided what you think I am, and now, because of that decision, we're here. You've decided that I'm a risk without knowing a single thing about me. And that, Alice, is the problem." The words were harsh, but necessary. Olivia knew that the truth wasn't always comfortable, especially when it had to be spoken directly. And in this case, the truth was clear. Alice's suspicion wasn't about the suitcase. It wasn't about Olivia's qualifications, her awards, or her impeccable history. It was about something deeper. It was about the biases that were so deeply embedded in the system that they no longer needed to be questioned. They had become invisible, unquestioned, accepted. Until now. Alice looked up, her eyes finally meeting Olivia's with a mixture of guilt and doubt. She was no longer sure of herself. She had started this with the assumption that Olivia was hiding something, but now, standing there in the cramped galley with the weight of the accusation on her shoulders, she wasn't so sure anymore. I'm sorry," Alice stammered. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Olivia interrupted, her tone softer now, but still firm. "What you meant to do doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you've just made an assumption based on nothing but fear. And it's not just you, Alice. It's the system. It's everyone who's ever looked at someone like me and thought that we're somehow different, somehow dangerous. The words echoed in the galley, hanging in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Alice stood frozen, her mind spinning, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. And then, as if realizing the enormity of what Olivia was saying, she took a hesitant step back. I don't know what to do now," Alice admitted quietly. Olivia exhaled slowly, her gaze softening as she studied the younger woman. "There's only one thing you can do, Alice. You can stop this. You can stop judging people based on assumptions and start seeing them for who they really are. This isn't about the silver case. This is about seeing the person in front of you." The flight attendant nodded, her eyes lowered. "I'm sorry, Miss Harris. I didn't realize." For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside the galley, the plane continued its steady flight through the skies, oblivious to the silent storm that had been brewing. Olivia, however, knew that this moment, this brief encounter with Alice, was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would change everything, was just starting. She could feel it, deep in her bones. This was no longer about a suitcase. It was about breaking down the walls that had been built by years of prejudice, fear, and misunderstanding. And the storm that had been stirred would not settle until that truth had been fully realized by everyone on board. The weight of truth. The world beyond the small, claustrophobic confines of the airplane seemed a distant reality. Despite the serene skies and the gentle hum of the engines, Olivia's mind raced with thoughts far heavier than the metal casing of her silver suitcase. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin continued to grow, palpable even in the air-conditioned calm. The whispers that had started with Alice's suspicion began to spread, unspoken but deeply felt by the passengers and crew alike. There was no turning back now. Olivia, ever composed, leaned back in her seat, her eyes closed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had spent a lifetime learning to control her outward appearance, to maintain the stillness even when the storm raged within. Her training had taught her that there was power in silence, in patience, and in watching. But now, as the weight of the flight began to press on her shoulders, the questions she had long kept buried began to surface. What if Alice wasn't the only one who saw her as a threat? What if the very recognition she had worked her entire life to achieve, the Medal of Freedom, the highest honor one could receive, was seen as little more than a mask for the fear and uncertainty others felt when faced with someone like her? Olivia had already been through so much. The years of sacrifice, the countless moments of doubt, the pain of watching others rise while she stayed in the shadows, unnoticed by those in power. Her career had been defined by working in the background, making decisions that could change the course of history, yet never receiving the credit. But when the Medal of Freedom had been presented to her, when she had finally been acknowledged for her contributions, the weight of that recognition felt almost too much to bear. It wasn't the honor that shook her, it was what it represented. It was a symbol that carried with it a certain expectation, an unspoken belief that finally she had made it, that she had earned a place among the most powerful in the country. But as she sat there, surrounded by strangers who couldn't see beyond the color of her skin or the mystery of her luggage, she realized how far that expectation had yet to go. The truth was that for all the recognition, for all the accolades, Olivia was still seen as different, still seen as an anomaly. And for some, like Alice, that difference made her a threat. It was at that moment that Olivia understood the power of perception. The way the world shaped her, the way it viewed her, had little to do with her actual worth or her actions. It was about what people saw, what they believed, and most importantly, what they feared. And that fear, the fear of the unknown, of what could not be easily explained, was what would continue to shape her journey, whether she liked it or not. The silence in the cabin was broken as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight's altitude and estimated time of arrival. Olivia's eyes fluttered open, the sound grounding her back to the present. It was as though the interruption had reminded her that there were still hours to go, hours in which this subtle conflict would only intensify. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the underlying current of tension that had spread like wildfire, moving from the flight attendants to the passengers. And now, Olivia suspected, even to the crew. A soft tap on her shoulder broke her thoughts. She turned slowly to face Mark Simmons, the freelance journalist she had met earlier. His expression was a curious blend of excitement and concern, his eyes flicking nervously to the flight attendants before landing on her. I hate to disturb you, but I just wanted to apologize for what happened earlier," Mark said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't realize that. Well, I didn't realize things would get so complicated." Olivia gave him a small smile, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There's no need to apologize, Mark. It wasn't your fault." Mark shifted awkwardly, glancing once more toward the back of the plane before sitting down beside her, his interest in her plainly evident. He had recognized her at the boarding gate, the Medal of Freedom recipient who had been celebrated in the media. And for him, meeting her was a chance to connect with someone who represented all that he had hoped for in his career, someone important, someone who had reached the pinnacle of success. But now, after the unsettling events that had unfolded, he found himself unsure of what to think. Was she really who she seemed? Or was there more to the story, a deeper mystery waiting to be uncovered? "I've been following your work for years," Mark continued, his voice laced with genuine admiration. "You've been involved in so many pivotal operations, things I can't even imagine. I've always admired your quiet strength, but now I'm not so sure what to believe." Olivia arched an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What do you mean, Mark?" He hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "Well, the way Alice and the crew acted toward you. It just doesn't sit right. I mean, you're Olivia Harris, for God's sake. You've received the highest honors in the country. So why are they treating you like this? Why are they so suspicious of you?" For a moment, Olivia was silent. She took in the weight of Mark's words, and the uncomfortable truth settled deeper within her. She had known it, of course. She had felt the prejudice, the fear, the judgment, but hearing it from someone outside the situation made it all the more real. Mark wasn't just any passenger. He was a journalist, someone who prided himself on telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. And here he was, grappling with the same question that had been plaguing Olivia her entire life. Why was she still being judged by her appearance rather than her actions? "You want to know the truth?" Olivia asked, her voice low but steady. "The truth is that people like me, people who look like me, they're never given the benefit of the doubt. No matter what we accomplish, no matter how much we give, there will always be someone who sees us as a threat, someone who assumes that our success is somehow undeserved." Mark looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and realization. "But that doesn't make sense. You've done more than anyone could imagine to serve this country. You've saved lives. You've done things that others wouldn't even dream of." Olivia's gaze softened, but there was an undeniable edge to her voice. "That doesn't matter. Not to everyone. People are often quick to dismiss what they don't understand. And for people like me, it's easy to make us the other, to make us the outlier, the danger, the anomaly. It's easier to create a narrative than it is to confront the reality of what's in front of you." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything more, the plane jolted slightly, the turbulence causing the cabin to shift. Olivia's grip tightened on the armrest, a reflex she couldn't suppress. But the sudden movement seemed to snap the entire cabin's attention back to the present. Everyone was jolted out of their private thoughts, and the tension that had been quietly simmering seemed to dissipate, at least for a moment. But even as the turbulence subsided, Olivia knew that the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. She felt it, deep in her bones, the inevitable confrontation that would follow, the moment when the truth would come to light, and when the judgment of those who misunderstood her would reach its peak. In the back of the plane, Alice stood near the galley, her eyes watching Olivia from a distance. She had made her decision. She had already crossed the line. And now, no matter how much she tried to justify it, the consequences of that choice were beginning to unfold. Alice's discomfort was palpable, but so was her resolve. She had already gone too far to turn back. And Olivia knew, as she looked out the window, that the battle for her dignity and her future was just beginning. What would happen next would not only determine the course of this flight, but would forever change the way they all saw each other. The moment of truth. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled out, the rhythmic hum of the engines accompanying the quiet tension that now blanketed the interior. Olivia sat still, her eyes staring out the window, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through years of experiences, of moments that had shaped her, of encounters both public and private where judgment had always been passed before understanding had ever been given. Her career had been one of service, of sacrifice, of untold dedication. But that silver suitcase, her medal, her life's work in a compact form, was now the very symbol of the prejudice she had battled for so long. It had never been easy for Olivia. Her rise through the ranks had been anything but conventional. From her first days as an intelligence officer, she had faced challenges that few would understand, and even fewer could appreciate. Every success she had earned had been tempered by assumptions and doubts. Doubts about her ability, her authority, and her worth. The path to the Medal of Freedom had been paved with countless moments of proving herself, of showing that she was capable not just in the eyes of her peers, but in the eyes of a world that wanted to look at her and see something other than a woman of distinction. Now, as the plane continued to soar high above the clouds, the same assumptions, the same doubts, threatened to strip away the one thing that had once felt like a validation of everything she had worked for. Alice had made her decision. It was a decision that she didn't even realize was being made. Her actions had been driven by a gut feeling, by an unspoken bias that had no place on this flight, but had found its way into her heart nonetheless. She could feel the heat of it as she stood in the galley, her hands fidgeting with a glass of water, her mind racing. She had never wanted to be the person who made false accusations, but the more she had observed Olivia, the more the feeling had grown. Something didn't sit right. It wasn't the case itself. It was the way Olivia carried herself, how guarded she seemed, how protective of her belongings. It made Alice uncomfortable, and in that discomfort, she had made a choice. But it wasn't just Alice. The flight attendants, the passengers, each of them had felt it. The shift in the atmosphere. People spoke in hushed tones, not daring to voice their suspicions too loudly, but the feeling was unmistakable. The fear had spread. Not just fear of what Olivia might be carrying in that suitcase, but fear of what it meant, what her presence, her achievements, and the unsettling silence that had fallen over the cabin signified. The world was divided by so many invisible lines, and for some, the dividing line was drawn between them and Olivia Harris. Olivia's hand reached out to her phone once more, and her thumb hovered over the screen. The flight had been long enough for her to catch up on some work, to return the congratulatory messages from the ceremony, but it was also long enough to sense the rising unease around her. Her instincts, sharpened over years of being on the edge, of operating in environments where every glance and every move counted, told her that it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated. But what form that escalation would take was still unclear. Mark Simmons, the journalist who had once been so thrilled by the chance to meet her, now sat across the aisle, clearly deep in thought. She could see his eyes darting between her and the flight attendants, the same unease reflected on his face that seemed to be present in everyone else's. His earlier questions about the situation, his gentle probing, felt like distant echoes now. He, too, had made an unspoken decision. To step back, to avoid making things worse. What had been curiosity had turned into uncertainty, and Olivia could feel that too. It was then that the flight crew, led by Alice, made their final move. Olivia could sense the moment it happened, the collective breath that the flight attendants took as they moved toward the front of the cabin. no longer whispering among themselves, but speaking with quiet urgency. Alice's voice, although low, carried an unmistakable edge of command as she approached the cockpit once more, her eyes darting back toward Olivia. "Captain, we need to talk," Alice said, her voice tense but controlled. Olivia heard the words even from her seat, her ears picking up the quiet urgency in Alice's tone. The captain's response was inaudible, but the exchange marked the point of no return. The decision had been made. Olivia was going to be confronted. For a few moments, there was no change in the atmosphere. The passengers, wrapped in their own worlds, went about their business, unaware of the storm gathering just beneath the surface. Olivia, though, knew the truth. She could feel the weight of it coming. She could feel it in the way the crew moved with a sense of purpose, in the subtle glances that flicked her way. The plane descended slightly, a gentle shift that should have felt unremarkable, but instead felt like the quiet before a storm. Olivia's fingers lightly gripped the armrest once more. She could feel the tension in her chest, but she also knew what she had to do. She had been trained for moments like this. She had been trained to stand tall, to speak the truth even when the world wanted to ignore it. And so, when the flight attendant, Alice, who had already made her suspicion clear, finally approached Olivia, the moment had arrived. "Miss Harris." Alice's voice was firm now, her expression set. "I'm afraid I need to ask you to come with me. There's a matter that needs addressing regarding your luggage." Olivia's heart beat a little faster, but her response was calm, her voice unwavering. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, looking Alice directly in the eye. "I've already shown my ticket and identification. I followed all the procedures." Alice didn't falter. "It's just a precaution," she said, her tone betraying the unease she still carried. "Please, come with me." Olivia's mind flashed back to the countless times she had been asked to prove herself, the moments where her word hadn't been enough. She had grown used to the whispers, the looks, the subtle doubts, and yet it still hurt. She had earned this moment. She had earned this flight, this honor, and yet none of it seemed to matter to Alice. None of it mattered because, in Alice's eyes, Olivia was still just another potential threat, an anomaly in a world that liked to categorize everything. Olivia stood up slowly, her body moving with the grace that had become second nature to her. She turned to face the other passengers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of their eyes upon her. They, too, had heard the exchange. They, too, had sensed the shift. Olivia wasn't just walking toward Alice now. She was walking toward something much larger. A reckoning of sorts. A moment where the world would see who she truly was, or at least who she had always been beneath the layers of suspicion and doubt. The flight attendants parted as she moved past them, their eyes lingering on her as if they weren't sure what to expect. Mark's eyes met hers as she walked toward the rear of the plane. And for a moment, he seemed to understand. He nodded ever so slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension that had built up between them. Alice led her to a small alcove near the galley, where the crew was now gathered. The captain, a tall man with a stern expression, stood with his arms crossed, waiting. Olivia's gaze swept over the small group. She knew what was about to happen, and she was ready. The truth would be unveiled. No more pretense, no more assumptions. "This is about the suitcase, isn't it?" Olivia asked, her voice steady, her eyes sharp. The captain nodded, his voice low. "We need to be sure. We're just taking precautions. It's protocol." "Protocol," Olivia repeated, her lips curling into a small, rueful smile. "It's always protocol, isn't it? But how many times have I followed the rules, played by the book, only to be treated like an outsider, like I don't belong?" Alice shifted uncomfortably, but Olivia didn't care anymore. This wasn't about her. This was about everything that had led to this moment. The systemic prejudices, the biases, the assumption that anyone who didn't fit a certain mold had to be questioned, doubted, scrutinized. "The suitcase doesn't contain what you think it does," Olivia continued, her tone cool. "It's a symbol of my lifetime of service, my contributions to this country. And I'm not going to allow you to reduce that to a suspicion, to fear." There was a long silence, and in that moment, Olivia understood something that she had always known deep down. It wasn't just about what was inside the suitcase. It was about what people saw when they looked at her. And in that quiet space, she knew it was time to stop apologizing for it.